They disclosed that $200 million, that's what they expect in 2025 to pay on account of tariffs. But these are just already announced tariffs. So principally the ones affecting imports from China of certain goods, and then obviously exports to China, the retaliatory tariffs that we know about. And so there's a lot of interest in this because in the pharmaceutical world in particular, there's a huge anxiety over how the kind of like sword of Damocles of specific pharmaceutical tariffs might affect the industry, what the percentage will be, how they might shake out. So Merck giving us at least some sense of how it's been so far is helpful. But listening to the earnings call, it's like a certain form of theater where analysts find new and inventive ways to ask the company, will you tell us what you're actually expecting from pharmaceutical tariffs if they come through as the president has promised to bring them about? And Merck kind of artfully dodging actually committing to that.
How exposed is Merck to China and maybe broader pharma companies in general? Because they do have this drug and they're facing stiff competition in China, and that's one of the really downfalls that the company faced in the previous quarter.
Yeah, I think Merck in particular faces tariff issues on two fronts. One, the retaliatory tariffs imposed by China make it difficult to sell products into China for any American company. They're sort of in the crosshairs of what Beijing is doing in retaliation to the White House. But then, maybe an even larger headwind for them is the potential of the United States imposing tariffs on the importation of pharmaceuticals, because Merck, like most of its peers, has a huge global manufacturing network, and in many cases will ship products to the US from, for example, Ireland, where they have a lot of manufacturing. And then this gets a little into the weeds of trade policy, but Merck, like many companies, has offshored the intellectual property behind some of its biggest drugs. So Keytruda, the biggest drug in pharmaceutical history, which is Merck's cancer drug, the IP lives in Ireland. And so that gets complicated.
Ireland. Okay.
That gets complicated in the if, and these are all ifs because we don't know, but if, for example, the president were to impose a 25% tariff on pharmaceuticals, then Merck could end up paying quite a bit simply to import its own product and basically the intellectual property of its own product from Ireland to the United States. So that's really the number that analysts are trying to get their heads around, both in terms of Merck and in global pharmaceuticals in general. And it remains a mystery because we don't know.
Merck based where, John Tucker?
That would be New Jersey.
That would be New Jersey. Yes, it would be Rahway, New Jersey, Johnson & Johnson, New Brunswick, New Jersey, just for those out there wondering. And we got Shearing Plow, Bristol Myers Squibb, all over the state.
I still have to visit New Jersey.
You have to visit New Jersey. How long have you been in New York?
7 years.
Jeez.
But I stay in the city.
Oh, please.
You are really missing out.
Jeez, all right. Damian, all right, let's frame out Merck. I mean, the stock is down 21% this year to date. That's the worst of the big pharma here. I've got Lilly up 10%. What's the story on Merck? What's the concern in the marketplace about Merck?
I think it boils down to Gardasil, which is Merck's blockbuster vaccine for HPV, which is a cancer-causing virus. It's one of the more, it's the only vaccine you can say prevents cancer. So this is a massive product around the world that Merck developed and has been marketing for more than a decade. The issue came about last year related to China, which is that there had been this massive boom in demand in China for this vaccine, which is paid for out of pocket. It's a luxury product for basically the wealthy of China. And then suddenly that demand seemed to fall off a cliff last year. And Merck didn't have initially much in the way of convincing explanation as to why that happened and why it might ameliorate. And slowly, quarter after quarter, the story got worse until in the first quarter of this year, they halted all shipments of Gardasil to China. So
voluntarily?
Yes, because the inventory had built up. The demand had fallen off a cliff such that their partner in China was apparently unable to sell the doses at the level that they were previously scrambling to meet the demand of. And so if you just subtract all of Gardasil's potential revenue in China, you're probably talking about $3 to $4 billion a year, which as you mentioned, in the context of Merck is not that big of a deal. And especially Keytruda, the cancer drug, can make that up in half a quarter. I think the issue really with the stock move you mentioned, and they're down 40% since first disclosing the Gardasil problems in China, relates to the fact that the company has not had a very convincing explanation for why it happened and why it's going to be ameliorated. And so you're seeing both a sort of, reputational kind of risk taking place there. And then furthermore, not unlike Wile E. Coyote running off a cliff, I think when the Gardasil situation worsened, investors started taking a hard look at the rest of Merck's portfolio heading into the rest of the decade, especially Keytruda, which will face lower cost competition around 2028, and kind of start to panic. Like, are we sure this company has a plan to withstand what's going to be a massive patent cliff?
What are your sources telling you? Why are they not explaining it then?
I think In fairness to Merck, I think they have been probably about as forthcoming as they can be. It's a little bit of a black box for them because, as I mentioned, they do business in China with respect to Gardasil through a Chinese company that is their distributor. So Merck on the US end is basically shipping doses according to what that company orders. They don't necessarily have, as that company would, the sort of like boots on the ground selling doses in China. So I think they were probably caught a little flat-footed. And I think reasonably, you could say that they didn't read the market well. We had a story earlier this week looking at the rise of biotech companies in China, which have rapidly come to develop vaccines of their own and are now seeking to supplant Gardasil in the country. And I think it's fair to say, and we've heard analysts say this, that Merck did not adequately assess the competitive dynamics on the ground there.